January 1943. High above the jungles of New Guinea, the air thins into something brittle and unforgiving. At 25,000 feet, sound carries differently. Engines lose their growl, breath becomes work. Sunlight glints hard off aluminum wings, sharp enough to hurt the eyes. A Japanese fighter pilot scans below him, confident. For months, altitude had been safety. American aircraft, heavy and clumsy, were expected to stay low. Gravity, drag, and engine limits had always favored him. The sky had rules. Everyone knew them. Then, above his canopy, a shape appears. Twin tails, long wings, steady, unrushed. It isn't diving from below. It isn't struggling upward. It is already there. The pilot blinks, checks his instruments, pulls back on the stick. His aircraft responds sluggishly. The engine gasps. The climb stalls. The American fighter does not. In that moment, something subtle but irreversible occurs. Not an explosion. Not a dogfight, a realization. That the ceiling he believed in was no longer real. That physics itself had been rewritten in metal and heat. And this quiet shock, unfolding in thin air, was the product of years of decisions made far from the battlefield. By the late 1930s, Japan's air doctrine had reached near mythic confidence. Pilots were trained to outmaneuver, outthink, and outfight any opponent. The Mitsubishi A6M0, lightweight and responsive, embodied this philosophy. With its long range and near-perfect agility, it was more than a plane. It was an extension of the pilot's instinct. Japan's early victories in China and the first months of the Pacific War seemed to confirm the Zero's supremacy. Japanese engineers and strategists believed that pilot skill, combined with superior maneuverability, outweighed raw engine power. Dogfights were expected to be tests of reflexes, not horsepower. Maximum altitude rarely mattered. Engagements typically happened under 15,000 feet, where the thin air and power loss of non-supercharged engines did not yet penalize performance. The Zero excelled here, climbing efficiently and turning sharply, but these advantages came at a cost. The Zero's light structure meant minimal armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and limited firepower. It was a delicate weapon, effective in skilled hands but vulnerable under sustained pressure. Its engine, naturally aspirated, lost significant power at high altitude. For pilots, this limit was invisible, a ceiling they simply did not anticipate needing to test. Early Japanese reports brimmed with confidence. Pilots often described the airspace as theirs, claiming that no Allied fighter could match their speed in a dogfight. Stories of outmaneuvering heavier American aircraft circulated in mess halls, reinforcing the belief that altitude was irrelevant. Their strategy focused on turning battles, chasing enemy fighters into endless spirals, and leaving bombers to fate. Yet the Pacific War was not fought on doctrine alone. As the Japanese advanced into the Solomons and New Guinea, the U.S. began deploying aircraft designed with a different philosophy. American engineers had studied the limits of engine performance at altitude, emphasizing speed, firepower, and the ability to climb rapidly. These aircraft, especially the twin-engine P-38 Lightning, were not built for elegant spirals or dogfighting finesse. They were built to punch through the air, literally defying the natural limits of performance at high altitude. The contrast between these two approaches would soon become stark. Japanese pilots, confident in what they understood, would be forced to confront what they did not, that mastery of the sky could be measured in numbers, materials, and supercharged engines, and that the ceiling they trusted, the invisible limit of the air itself, was about to disappear. The stage was set. A clash of philosophies, of physics, and of human perception, all unfolding hundreds of feet above the jungles and coral islands of the Pacific. Across the Pacific, American aviation was approaching war with a different mindset. Prior to Pearl Harbor, U.S. doctrine emphasized industrial strength, engineering precision, and the potential of technology to overcome natural limits. Fighters like the Lockheed P-38 Lightning were born of these ideas: long-range, high-powered, and capable of reaching altitudes that Japanese aircraft could only dream of. Turbo superchargers, in particular, became the secret weapon, compressing thin air at 25,000 feet or more, allowing engines to maintain horsepower where naturally aspirated engines lost it. The P-38's twin engines and long fuselage created a silhouette unfamiliar to Japanese pilots. Its cockpit, high and pressurized with oxygen supply, gave American pilots endurance at altitudes where the Zero's performance collapsed. Designers had studied air density, drag, and thermodynamics, exploiting the limits of physics rather than relying on pilot skill alone. Every structural decision from propeller size to radiator placement was calculated to maximize performance in conditions previously considered prohibitive. By mid-1942, U.S. forces were already flying combat missions in the Solomons and over New Guinea. Pilots began to notice that above 20,000 feet, the Japanese Zeros seemed to falter. They could climb, yes, but each vertical maneuver bled speed. Dogfighting at altitude, once a theoretical exercise, exposed the Zero's vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, American fighters simply kept climbing. The difference was subtle at first, almost imperceptible, a slight lag in acceleration. A hesitating engine note, but it accumulated into a tangible advantage. Japanese reports from these early encounters reveal a mix of disbelief and confusion. Pilots described ghosts of aircraft appearing suddenly at altitudes they thought unreachable. They laughed at the heavy, awkward shapes, only to realize minutes later that the Americans were where physics should have prevented them. The P-38, P-47 Thunderbolt, and later the P-51 Mustang could exploit the vertical dimension fully, using altitude as a weapon. The Americans were fighting with gravity, air density, and temperature as illas rather than obstacles. The implications were enormous. Air superiority was no longer merely a matter of skill or courage, it was engineering applied at scale. Japanese doctrine, based on agility and pilot intuition, was suddenly at a disadvantage in an invisible arena. By the time a dogfight actually began, the stage had already shifted. Japanese pilots would soon learn that their assumptions about the sky, the invisible rules they had trained for, were no longer valid. Above the Pacific Islands, an invisible war of physics had begun, and it was about to reshape every engagement, every strategy, and every perception of what air combat truly meant. For Japanese pilots, the first encounters with high-altitude American fighters were disorienting. Many had trained their entire careers to rely on instinct and precise maneuvering, trusting that their aircraft would respond faster than anything they might face. At lower altitudes, this philosophy worked perfectly. Zeros outturned bombers, Ki-43s spiraled effortlessly to evade heavier aircraft, and pilots felt invincible. Then came the high-altitude interceptions. Pilots suddenly realized that their finely honed skills could not compensate for diminished engine power. Climbing beyond 20,000 feet became exhausting, both physically and mentally. Oxygen masks fogged, instruments flickered, and engines sputtered. Even a skilled pilot could not force a Zero to match the vertical acceleration of a turbocharged P-38. Confidence gave way to confusion. Accounts from the time describe an eerie combination of disbelief and fear. One pilot, recalling a confrontation over Rebel, noted how an American fighter rose above us effortlessly, as though gravity had no hold on it. Laughter in the cockpit. Once a reflex to superior performance became a nervous, hollow sound. The human mind struggled to reconcile experience with reality. The enemy was doing what should have been impossible. This psychological shock had immediate tactical consequences. Pilots hesitated to climb aggressively, wary of losing airspeed. Engagement slowed. Confidence, once the invisible armor of the Japanese Air Force, began to erode. The human dimension, the very pilot skill that had once dominated the Pacific skies, was no longer sufficient. When physics itself worked against them, the difference in performance was not magic. It was engineering. American aircraft like the P-38 Lightning and later P-47 Thunderbolt were equipped with turbo superchargers. These devices compressed thin air at high altitudes before it entered the engine, maintaining horsepower where naturally aspirated engines faltered. At 25,000 feet, a Zero's engine might produce barely half its sea-level power, while a turbocharged American fighter maintained near full performance. Reports from Japanese engineers and pilots alike show an astonishment bordering on disbelief. Calculations suggested that no aircraft should climb as fast at such altitudes. The P-38 violated expectations structurally, aerodynamically, and psychologically. Pilots saw a heavy twin-engine fighter rise above them, seeming to ignore the rules they had understood for years. This was technology rewriting the battlefield, a silent yet overwhelming advantage that would soon redefine air combat across the Pacific. Japanese air combat doctrine emphasized dogfighting in tight turns. Pilots trained to outturn the enemy, relying on agility and speed at low to medium altitudes. The expectation was simple: outmaneuver, then strike. At high altitudes, this tactic became a liability. American fighters adopted a boom and zoom approach, diving from altitude to strike and then climbing back before the Japanese could respond. With turbocharged engines, the Americans could dictate the terms of engagement. They could climb higher, dive faster, and control energy throughout a fight. The vertical plane became a decisive factor, one the Japanese had not anticipated. Tactically, this shift was subtle but devastating. Engagements were no longer about dogged perseverance in a spiral of turns. They became about positioning, energy management, and exploiting altitude. Japanese pilots faced a harsh reality. Their trusted combat style was being nullified, not by skill, but by mechanical advantage. The battle was increasingly decided before the first shot was fired, in a silent war above the clouds. The stage was now set for deeper analysis. Leadership, doctrine, and the enemy perspective would reveal the full. American air doctrine in the Pacific reflected an adaptability born from necessity. Commanders like Claire Chennault and later commanders in the Solomons understood that air power was not just a matter of numbers, it was a matter of exploiting innovation. Pilots were trained to fight in energy-efficient ways, to use altitude as a weapon, and to trust aircraft performance. Doctrine emphasized flexibility. If the enemy outmaneuvered you at low altitude, climb. If they held the sky, force them into positions they could not exploit. By contrast, Japanese doctrine had remained rigid. Decades of training emphasized turning ability and pilot intuition. Success was measured by how well a pilot could fight within these parameters. When confronted with an opponent that ignored traditional rules, the hierarchy faltered. Pilots were instructed to rely on agility, yet the enemy rendered that skill secondary. Leadership could not adapt fast enough to counter a mechanical advantage that existed outside the established doctrine. This mismatch was evident in mission reports. Japanese commanders often noted the unexpected behavior of American aircraft, calling it reckless or impossible, yet these behaviors were calculated, deliberate, and fully within the design of their aircraft. Leadership at all levels faced a crisis: how to instruct pilots to fight in ways that defied their training and expectations. For Japanese pilots, the first glimpses of turbocharged fighters were almost surreal. Encounter reports describe seeing heavy, lumbering aircraft climbing as if aided by the wind itself. Some pilots assumed mechanical malfunction at first, only to realize minutes later that the American fighters were operating as designed. The initial laughter and mockery in Japanese cockpits turned to frustration and fear. Pilots could not match the vertical maneuverability of American planes, and their confidence in the Zero's superiority began to erode. Reconnaissance pilots noted that the enemy rises faster than physics allows, a phrase repeated in multiple debriefs, highlighting the psychological shock. Even seasoned leaders struggled to interpret the implications. Many assumed it was a temporary advantage, a fluke caused by weather or engine tuning. Few realized the systemic nature of the threat: turbocharged engines, industrial capacity, and rigorous pilot training would allow the Americans to control the high-altitude arena consistently. The enemy's own reporting became a record of disbelief, turning into tactical disadvantage at a human level. The encounters challenged a fundamental assumption: bravery alone cannot overcome physical limits. Japanese pilots had flown with unmatched courage, risking their lives to protect fleets and strike strategic targets. Yet, when confronted by the mechanical advantages of the P-38 or P-47, courage became insufficient. Strategically, this shift reshaped the Pacific Air War. Control of high altitudes allowed the Americans to dictate engagements, intercept bombers, and strike first. It forced the Japanese to respond reactively, building aircraft like the K-84 and Ki-100 too late to regain the advantage. Moral and strategic confidence, the invisible currency of air warfare, shifted slowly but irrevocably. The sky, once a familiar battlefield, had become a vertical chessboard where only those who understood and exploited the laws of physics could win. This full perspective human, technological, tactical, leadership, enemy, and moral sets the stage for the decisive moments. Pilots would soon face the turning point where all these factors collided. The morning of March 5, 1943, over the dense jungles of New Guinea, was deceptively calm. Mist hovered above the canopy. Birdsong was swallowed by the distant roar of engines. Japanese Zeros streaked over the hills, confident in altitude and agility. They were hunting, as always, expecting the familiar dance of dogfight and evasion. Then came the first sightings of the P-38 Lightning. Twin tails cutting through sunlight, engines screaming at altitude, climbing faster than any Zero could follow. Japanese pilots squinted against the glare. At 25,000 feet, their aircraft sputtered. The climb rate dropped sharply. The Americans continued upward, climbing without hesitation, engines fully performing where physics should have dictated weakness. Initial skirmishes were chaotic. Zeros attempted to engage, diving and spiraling in the maneuvers they trusted. But the P-38s did not turn. They stayed above, trading speed for position. Pilots describing the scene later recalled a sky that moved around us without permission. In moments, the Americans could dive, attack, and climb again before the Japanese could react. One engagement over the Huon Gulf crystallized the turning point. A flight of 6 Zeros pursued a lone P-38. They gained altitude slowly, straining engines and pilots alike. The P-38 pilot, flying coolly, climbed past 28,000 feet, seemingly untouchable. From above, he dove into a boom and zoom attack. By the time the Zeros recovered, 2 had been destroyed, and the rest forced into retreat. The battle lasted minutes, but the psychological impact endured far longer. Japanese pilots began to grasp the new reality. The Americans had rewritten the rules of the sky. Climbing higher than any naturally aspirated Japanese aircraft could follow, controlling engagements through energy and altitude, they forced a new paradigm. Confidence turned to disbelief, disbelief to caution, and caution into fear. The battle over New Guinea was not just tactical. It marked the moment when the invisible ceiling, once taken for granted, was shattered. Above the Pacific Islands, the war was now being fought in 3 dimensions: speed, altitude, and human endurance. Every sortie tested not just skill, but the limits of human and machine alike. By late April 1943, the pattern was unmistakable. Over the Solomon Islands, air combat had entered a new phase. Japanese pilots, once untouchable masters of the sky, were now cautious, hesitant, even fearful. The Americans, exploiting turbocharged engines, climbed to altitudes previously considered unreachable, striking with precision before the Japanese could react. The Battle of New Georgia illustrates the shift with brutal clarity. On May 10, 1943, a formation of 36 Zeros intercepted a squadron of P-38s escorting American bombers. At first glance, the Japanese pilots laughed at the heavy, unfamiliar aircraft. Yet, as they attempted to climb, their engines struggled. The P-38s, fully oxygenated and turbocharged, ascended effortlessly, holding altitude while the Japanese fell behind. Within minutes, the Zeros were vulnerable. A P-38 dive created a flash of aluminum and fire. 2 Japanese planes were gone before the others could even maneuver effectively. The remaining pilots attempted desperate spirals, but energy management dictated their fate. The Americans controlled the vertical plane, dictating when, where, and how engagements occurred. This was more than skill, it was physics weaponized. American pilots could trade altitude for speed, forcing Japanese fighters into positions where their aircraft could not respond. Japanese reports from these encounters repeatedly used phrases like beyond comprehension or climbing impossible. The reality was stark. A technological advantage had become a decisive force multiplier. By the end of May, kill ratios reflected this new dominance. Where earlier in the war Japanese pilots had enjoyed near total air superiority, the tables were now turning. Even elite aces found themselves outclimbed, outmaneuvered, and outmatched at altitudes they had assumed safe. The turning point was clear. Mastery of the sky now required understanding and exploiting physics, not just relying on courage or skill. The Japanese pilot's laughter, once a sign of confidence, had vanished. In its place grew a sober acknowledgement. The war in the air had changed forever. The aftermath of these encounters would reshape not just tactics, but entire strategies across the Pacific, leaving the Japanese air forces scrambling to adapt while the Americans seized the invisible high ground. The impact of high-altitude American fighters over the Pacific was immediate and profound. Japanese air units that had once operated with near-total confidence suddenly faced limitations they had never trained for. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese aerial dominance, was now vulnerable at altitudes above 20,000 feet. Its engine could no longer maintain power, its light frame could not withstand sustained high-speed dives, and its maneuverability advantage was neutralized. Tactically, American pilots began to dictate engagements. Climbing above the enemy allowed them to choose when to strike, where to strike, and when to retreat. Japanese formations could no longer force combat on their terms. Reports from the Solomons and New Guinea highlighted a pattern. Zeros were losing pilots and aircraft, not just in direct dogfights, but before the first shots were fired. High-altitude control had become a silent killer. The psychological effects were just as significant. Japanese pilots, trained to rely on instinct and turning superiority, now hesitated. Confidence, the invisible armor that had sustained them through early victories, eroded. Some debriefs describe veterans struggling to adapt, noting that American aircraft appeared where they should not have been and moved faster than reason allowed. Commanders were forced to reconsider tactics, yet doctrine remained largely unchanged. On the American side, morale soared. Pilots recognized that their machines provided an advantage beyond mere numbers or skill. Reports praised the P-38 and P-47 for their ability to maintain power at extreme altitudes, enabling the boom and zoom tactics that had proven devastating. The integration of turbo-superchargers and careful energy management turned each sortie into a calculated exercise in control, rather than a gamble of skill alone. Strategically, these encounters set the stage for sustained American air superiority in the Pacific. Bombers could now be escorted safely at higher altitudes, airfields could be interdicted with reduced risk, and Japanese counterattacks were increasingly costly. The invisible ceiling above the Pacific Islands had shifted, and with it the balance of power in the air. As 1943 progressed, the consequences of high-altitude American dominance became unmistakable. Japanese aircraft production struggled to keep pace with losses, and even new designs could not immediately counter the vertical advantage of American fighters. The Ki-84 Frank and Ki-100 appeared on the horizon, more powerful and robust than the Zero, yet their numbers were limited and deployment slow. By the time they entered combat, the Americans had already mastered high-altitude tactics, further widening the gap. Fuel shortages and logistical constraints compounded Japanese problems. High-altitude performance demanded engines capable of operating in thin, cold air, but Japanese manufacturing could not produce sufficient quantities. Many aircraft that could theoretically match American fighters at altitude were relegated to low-level operations, leaving the Americans free to control the skies above. The strategic ramifications extended beyond individual battles. With control of the vertical dimension, American forces could conduct bombing missions with relative safety, intercept reconnaissance aircraft, and strike supply lines with minimal opposition. Japanese pilots were increasingly forced into reactive roles, defending positions and reacting to threats rather than initiating engagements. The initiative had shifted irreversibly. Reports from the period underscore the scale of this shift. Allied records note that by mid-1943, Japanese air losses were mounting faster than reinforcements could arrive. Pilots who survived encounters with high-altitude American fighters described the experience as beyond anything we trained for, reflecting the deep psychological impact. The war in the air was no longer solely a test of courage and skill. It had become a contest of engineering, altitude mastery, and disciplined energy management. By the end of 1943, the Pacific Air War had been fundamentally transformed. The once untouchable Japanese forces were now fighting under conditions their training had not prepared them for. Control of the sky was no longer a matter of experience or bravery alone. It belonged to those who understood the invisible physics above the islands and exploited them fully. Above the Pacific Islands, the laughter of Japanese pilots faded into silence. What had once been confidence in skill and maneuverability gave way to a sober awareness. The rules of the sky had changed. Courage alone could not overcome machines designed to climb higher, dive faster, and exploit the very laws of physics. The air itself had become a weapon. This moment illustrates a deeper truth about warfare. Technology, when paired with strategy and training, can redefine the battlefield in ways that outpace doctrine and tradition. The P-38s and P-47s were not invincible. They did not rely on magic or superstition. They relied on engineering, calculation, and relentless testing human intellect applied to the physical limits of the world. For Japanese forces, the lesson was harsh and unavoidable. The vertical dimension mattered. Ignoring it had been costly. Adaptation was possible, but time, resources, and numbers were against them. The invisible high ground, the sky above the islands, had been claimed, shaping every engagement to come. And for history, this shift resonates beyond the Pacific. It reminds us that human skill and courage, while vital, are sometimes subordinate to preparation, innovation, and understanding the environment in which one fights. In the thin air above New Guinea, New Georgia, and the Solomons, pilots discovered a reality both simple and profound. Mastery of the sky requires not just daring, but a deep comprehension of the physics that govern it. Above the clouds, in the quiet of high altitudes, the war had already been decided.